He stood silent at the defendant's podium, hands clasped behind his back in perfect military precision. No red tunic, no towering bearskin hat, just a plain grey suit that couldn't hide what he really was. Judge Frank Caprio had seen thousands of people in that exact spot. College students with parking tickets, working mothers explaining why they couldn't pay their fines, taxi drivers caught speeding between fares. But when this man opened his mouth, the words that came out stopped the entire courtroom cold. "I was racing to keep a promise to a dying man, Your Honor." What happened next left America's kindest judge in tears and reminded everyone why some promises are worth breaking rules for. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from around the world. We love hearing from you. Now, let's get into it. The morning drizzle had left Providence feeling grey and muted, like the city was wrapped in wet wool. Inside the municipal courthouse on Dorrance Street, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting that particular institutional glow that made everyone look slightly tired. Coffee-stained legal briefs rustled in lawyers' hands. The worn wooden benches creaked under the weight of people who'd rather be anywhere else. But this wasn't just any courtroom. This was Judge Frank Caprio's domain, and that made all the difference. The air carried something different here, less of the heavy dread that usually clung to judicial proceedings, more of a nervous anticipation. People came from across the country, sometimes across the world, not because they had to, but because they'd heard the stories. They'd seen the videos. They knew about the judge, who treated defendants like neighbours instead of criminals. A young mother bounced her fussing baby against her shoulder, whispering soothing words while keeping one eye on the clock. Behind her, an elderly man in work clothes thumbed through a crumpled citation, his lips moving silently as he rehearsed his explanation. 3 college students from Brown University sat in the back row, notebooks out, studying not for exams, but for life, watching how mercy could exist within justice. They were all waiting for the same thing, to see if the legend matched the reality. If Frank Caprio was really as human as the internet claimed. At 9:47 a.m., the side door opened with its familiar creak, and the man himself emerged. 73 years old, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd been climbing those steps to the bench for decades. His black robe hung loosely, comfortable as an old sweater. Behind wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes held the warmth that had made him famous, the kind of gaze that saw past citations to the person underneath. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his Rhode Island accent rolling gently through the room like a familiar melody. No formal proclamations, no ceremony, just a greeting that somehow made strangers feel welcome in a place that usually felt anything but. The regular court watchers knew the routine. Caprio would adjust his glasses, shuffle through the morning's docket, maybe crack a joke about the weather or the Red Sox. Then the parade would begin. Parking violations, moving violations, the occasional dispute over snow emergency zones. Each case handled with the same blend of fairness and humanity that had made this modest courtroom more famous than some Supreme Court chambers. But today felt different. Even Caprio sensed it, though he couldn't put his finger on why. Something in the air seemed heavier, more expectant. He glanced out over the assembled crowd, noting the usual mix of locals and visitors, the nervous defendants and curious observers. His eyes lingered a moment longer than usual on the man standing at the defendant's table. There was nothing flashy about him, medium height, dark hair neatly trimmed, wearing a plain grey suit that looked like it had been pressed that morning. But something in his bearing caught the judge's attention. The way he stood, perfectly upright, without seeming rigid. The way his hands were clasped precisely behind his back, the way his eyes focused straight ahead with a kind of disciplined attention that spoke of years of training. Caprio had been on the bench long enough to recognize a veteran when he saw one, but this was something more specific. This was military precision distilled into civilian clothing. The kind of posture that became second nature after years of standing perfectly still while the world swirled around you. The clerk's voice cut through the morning hum, professional and practiced. Docket number 2847, Lance Corporal James Ellison. The name hung in the air for a moment before its full weight registered. A ripple of whispered recognition spread through the gallery. Someone in the back row leaned forward. A woman near the front adjusted her glasses for a better look. The college students stopped taking notes, their attentions suddenly riveted. Lance Corporal. Not former, not veteran, active duty. The man in the grey suit stepped forward to the podium with movements that were economical, precise, almost choreographed. Each step was the exact length of the one before. His hands found their position on the wooden ledge, as if they'd been trained to that exact placement. When he stopped, he was perfectly centred, perfectly still. And in that stillness, something clicked for the observers who knew what to look for. This wasn't just military bearing. This was something more specialised, more refined. This was the kind of motionless discipline that could withstand hours of tourists trying to make you flinch, the kind that could ignore jeers, laughter, even physical provocation. This was a royal guard. A murmur started in the back row and spread forward like a wave. "Is that one of those guards? The palace ones?" The whisper carried just far enough for others to catch it, heads turning, eyes widening with recognition and curiosity. Judge Caprio looked down at the man, then at his paperwork, then back again. In all his years on the bench, he'd seen defendants from every walk of life, but he was pretty sure this was his first member of the Queen's Guard. "Good morning, sir," Caprio said, his tone carrying its usual warmth but tinged with genuine curiosity. "And you are Lance Corporal Ellison, is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honour." The reply came crisp and clear, the accent unmistakably British. His voice carried the kind of respectful authority that came from years of dealing with civilians while representing something larger than himself. Caprio adjusted his glasses and glanced at the citation. "You've been issued a ticket for speeding, 55 in a 35 zone on Chalkstone Avenue, approximately 11:30 p.m. last Thursday. Is that accurate?" "Yes, Your Honour." The response was immediate, unqualified. No hedging, no "well, actually," no attempt to minimise or explain away the facts. Just acknowledgement of what had happened. The judge leaned back slightly, studying the young man. Speeding tickets were the bread and butter of municipal court. He saw dozens every week. College kids running late for exams, shift workers trying to make it home, parents rushing to pick up children. Each had their story, their explanation, their plea for understanding. But something about this case already felt different. Maybe it was the man's bearing, the way he stood, like he was on ceremonial duty even in civilian clothes. Maybe it was the simple directness of his responses, no elaborate explanations or defensive justification. Or maybe it was just that Caprio had spent enough years reading people to know when someone was carrying weight that went far beyond a traffic citation. "Now, Mr. Ellison," the judge continued, settling into his chair and leaning forward with the engaged attention that had made him beloved by millions. "I see here you're visiting from London. What brings you to Providence?" "I'm staying with a friend, Your Honour, another veteran." Another small ripple through the courtroom. The story was getting more interesting by the moment, and everyone could sense it. "And on this particular night, you were driving on Chalkstone Avenue at nearly midnight, going 20 miles over the speed limit. The officer's report says you didn't argue with him, didn't make excuses, just accepted the citation." Caprio looked up from the paperwork. "But this court isn't just about punishment. It's about understanding. So help me understand, why were you driving that fast?" For the first time since approaching the podium, James Ellison's perfect composure flickered. Not dramatically, just a slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in his breathing. The kind of micro-expression that revealed the moment when someone's careful control met an unexpected emotional current. He was quiet for several heartbeats, his gaze fixed on something beyond the judge's shoulder. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but carried a weight that made everyone in the courtroom lean forward slightly. "I was returning from Rhode Island Hospital, Your Honour." And just like that, the atmosphere in the room shifted completely. Those 4 words, returning from Rhode Island Hospital, landed in the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of absolute attention that comes when people sense they're about to hear something that matters. Judge Caprio's expression softened immediately. He'd heard that particular phrase countless times before, and it never meant anything good. Hospital visits at midnight weren't about routine checkups or elective procedures. They were about emergencies, complications, last chances. "I see," Caprio said gently, his voice carrying the practiced compassion of someone who'd spent decades listening to people's worst moments. "And you were visiting someone there?" Ellison's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the podium. "Yes, Your Honor, a friend of mine, a fellow veteran." The courtroom had gone completely still. Even the baby who'd been fussing earlier seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. The college students had stopped whispering. The clerk's fingers hovered motionless over her keyboard. "Tell me about this friend," Caprio said, settling back in his chair with the patient attention that had made his courtroom famous. For a moment, it seemed like Ellison might maintain his military composure, give another brief, factual response. But something in the judge's tone, the genuine interest, the complete absence of judgment, seemed to crack open a door that had been carefully sealed. "Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves, United States Marine Corps," Ellison began, his voice carrying a new note of something deeper than mere respect. "We served together in Afghanistan, Helmand Province, 2018. He paused, his gaze dropping to the wooden surface of the podium before rising again to meet Caprio's eyes. "He saved my life." The simple statement hung in the air, carrying more weight than elaborate explanations could have managed. 3 words that encompassed experiences most people couldn't imagine, bonds forged in circumstances that turned strangers into family. "We were on a joint patrol," Ellison continued, his voice taking on the careful cadence of someone recounting events they'd replayed thousands of times. British and American forces working together to clear a compound that intelligence said was being used as an IED factory. The courtroom remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. This wasn't just about a traffic ticket anymore. This was about something much larger, much more important. The intel was good, too good. They were waiting for us. Ellison's jaw tightened slightly. "Command detonated explosive, buried under what looked like a routine doorway. When it went off..." He stopped, his breathing controlled but deliberate. For someone trained to stand motionless for hours, regardless of what happened around him, this moment of visible internal struggle was particularly striking. "I was closest to the blast, thrown backward, pinned under debris. Concussion, probably some internal bleeding, definitely confused. The rest of the patrol was regrouping, trying to figure out casualties, establish a perimeter." His voice remained steady, factual, but carried an undercurrent of something much more personal. Sergeant Reeves was 30 meters away when the IED went off. He could have stayed in cover, called for medical support, followed standard protocol for casualty evacuation. Ellison looked directly at Judge Caprio. Instead, he ran towards the explosion. A woman in the front row pressed a tissue to her eyes. One of the elderly men in the gallery, clearly a veteran himself based on the way he carried his shoulders, nodded slowly, recognizing the kind of split-second decision that separates heroes from everyone else. He pulled me out while gunfire was still coming from the compound, dragged me across 50 meters of open ground with bullets kicking up dust around our feet. Kept talking to me the whole time, telling me to stay awake, stay with him. Ellison's voice dropped slightly. I found out later he'd taken shrapnel in his leg from the same explosion, but he never mentioned it, never slowed down. Caprio leaned forward, completely absorbed in the story. This wasn't the kind of testimony he usually heard in traffic court. This was something rawer, more human. The medevac helicopter found us because Reeves kept popping smoke grenades, marking our position even though it made us a target. He stayed with me until I was loaded on the bird, then went back to help with the rest of the wounded. Ellison paused. That was the kind of man he was. Is. Someone who runs toward the trouble when everyone else is running away. Judge Caprio removed his glasses, polishing them slowly, a gesture that had become unconscious over the years when he needed a moment to process particularly difficult testimony. And he's here now? In Rhode Island Hospital? Ellison nodded. He moved to Providence after discharge, built a life here, got married, had a daughter, started working construction, using the skills the course taught him. His voice tightened slightly. But the war doesn't always let you go. The phrase lingered in the air with the kind of truth that needed no explanation. Everyone in the courtroom, whether they'd served or not, understood that some experiences leave marks that never fully fade. Lung problems, Ellison continued quietly. Complications from all the dust and smoke we breathed over there. It's been getting worse over the past year. This week, he stopped, composing himself. This week, the doctors said it was time to call family. A collective intake of breath rippled through the gallery. Even without the details, everyone understood what that meant. Time to call family. Time to say goodbye. So I flew from London to be with him, Ellison said simply, because 6 years ago he wouldn't let me die alone in a foreign country. I wasn't going to let him face this alone either. The weight of that commitment, flying across an ocean to sit beside a dying friend, settled over the courtroom like a blanket. Judge Caprio found himself blinking back tears, his usual professional composure challenged by the simple humanity of what he was hearing. "And on the night you were cited for speeding?" Caprio asked gently. I'd been at the hospital since early morning, sitting with him, talking when he was awake, just being present when he wasn't. Ellison's voice carried a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. The nurses finally told me visiting hours were over, that I needed to get some rest. But I knew... He paused. I knew his wife would be back first thing in the morning, and I wanted to be there too. I didn't want there to be any moment when he was alone. He straightened slightly, returning to that military bearing that seemed to be his default setting. So yes, Your Honour, I was speeding. I was trying to get back to where I'm staying so I could shower, change clothes, maybe get a few hours of sleep before returning to the hospital. I wasn't paying attention to my speed because my mind was back in that room, wondering if he was comfortable, if he was scared, if... Ellison's voice caught for just a moment before he regained control. When the officer's lights came on behind me, I knew immediately what I'd done. And I knew I had no excuse for it. I broke the law because I was distracted by worry, and that's not acceptable. He met Caprio's gaze directly. I didn't argue with the officer because he was right. I was speeding. The reason might be understandable, but it doesn't change the fact that I chose to drive faster than the law allows. The courtroom remained completely silent as Ellison finished speaking. Even the usual background noise, shuffling papers, muffled conversation, the creak of old wooden benches, had stopped. Everyone was absorbed in a story that had transformed a simple traffic violation into something much more profound. Judge Caprio sat quietly for a long moment, his hands folded on the bench in front of him. He'd built his reputation on being able to see past the surface of cases, to understand the human circumstances that led people to his courtroom. But this was different. This wasn't just about understanding. This was about recognizing something exceptional. "Mr. Ellison," he said finally, his voice soft but carrying clearly through the silent room, "in all my years on this bench, I've heard thousands of explanations for speeding. People late for work, rushing to pick up children, trying to make it to important appointments." He paused, removing his glasses and setting them carefully on the desk. "But I don't think I've ever heard anything quite like what you've just told us." He looked up at the young man standing so perfectly still at the podium. "You served your country with honour. You've travelled thousands of miles to be with a friend who's dying. And when you made a mistake, a completely understandable mistake, under tremendous emotional stress, you took full responsibility for it without making excuses." Caprio's voice was beginning to carry an emotional weight that matched the gravity of Ellison's story. "That tells me more about your character than any citation could tell me about your driving." But Ellison wasn't finished. Standing there in his grey civilian suit, maintaining the perfect posture that had been drilled into him through years of ceremonial duty, he seemed to make a decision. The kind of decision that comes when someone realizes that this moment, this interaction with this particular judge, in this particular courtroom, was worth breaking his own rules about silence. "Your Honour," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "there's something else you should know about Sergeant Reeves. Something that might help you understand why I was willing to risk a speeding ticket to get back to him." Caprio leaned forward, sensing that whatever came next would be important. When he pulled me out of that compound, when he dragged me to safety while bullets were flying around us, he kept talking to me, trying to keep me conscious, keep me focused. Ellison's voice took on a different quality, as if he were recounting something sacred. Most of what he said was standard stuff. Stay with me, we're almost there, you're going to be fine. But there was one thing he said that I've never forgotten. The courtroom seemed to lean in collectively, drawn by the intimacy of what was being shared. He said, "Ellison, you don't get to quit on me. We're both going home, you understand, both of us. And someday when this is all over, we're going to sit somewhere safe and remember this moment. But we're only going to remember it because we both survived it." Ellison's voice remained steady, but there was something in his eyes that spoke to the weight of carrying those words for 6 years. He was right. We both made it home. But he's been fighting a different kind of war ever since. Against the damage that deployment did to his lungs, his sleep, his ability to be the husband and father he wanted to be. He paused. And now, sitting in that hospital room, watching him fight for every breath, all I can think about is that promise he made, that we were both going home. The silence that followed was profound. Even Judge Caprio, known for his quick wit and ready responses, seemed momentarily speechless. "So when I drive too fast because I'm worried about missing his last moments," Ellison continued, "it's not just about friendship. It's about honouring a promise made by a man who risked his life to keep me alive. He told me we were both going home, and I need him to know that he was right, that even if home looks different than we thought it would, we both made it." For the first time since Ellison had begun speaking, movement returned to the courtroom. A woman in the second row openly wiped tears from her eyes. One of the elderly veterans in the back stood up briefly, as if compelled to show respect, before sitting back down. Even the college students seemed to understand they were witnessing something beyond their textbook understanding of justice. Judge Caprio found himself struggling with emotions that went far beyond his usual courtroom experience. He'd built his reputation on compassion, on seeing the humanity behind the citations and violations that filled his docket. But this was different. This was a reminder of what it meant to honour bonds forged in circumstances most people would never face. "Mr. Ellison," Caprio said, his voice thick with emotion, "I need you to know something. I've been on this bench for over 40 years. I've heard stories that would break your heart, seen people at their worst moments and their best moments. But what you've just shared with us—" He paused, struggling to find words adequate to the moment. "What you've shared reminds me why I became a judge in the first place. Not to punish, but to understand. Not to enforce rules blindly, but to recognize that behind every citation is a human being with a story that matters." The judge's voice was beginning to crack, despite his efforts to maintain composure. The entire courtroom could see him fighting back tears as he continued. "Your friend, Sergeant Reeves, he saved your life. But standing here today, listening to you honour his sacrifice, honour your commitment to him." Caprio's voice broke completely for a moment. "You're saving something too. You're saving the memory of what it means to keep promises when it costs you something." He removed his glasses completely now, no longer trying to hide the tears that were flowing freely down his cheeks. The courtroom watched in respectful silence as one of America's most beloved judges allowed himself to be moved beyond professional boundaries by the simple power of human loyalty. "I have a son," Caprio said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and I pray to God that if he's ever in trouble, if he ever needs someone to cross an ocean to be with him, he has a friend like you." The words hung in the air like a benediction. In the gallery, people found themselves crying alongside the judge, not because the story was sad, but because it was beautiful. Because in a world that often seemed to reward selfishness and cynicism, they were witnessing something pure, loyalty that transcended convenience, friendship that honoured sacrifice, and justice that recognised the difference between law and humanity. Ellison remained standing at perfect attention throughout the judge's emotional response, but something in his eyes had softened. For a man trained to remain unmoved, regardless of external circumstances, he seemed genuinely affected by Caprio's words. "Thank you, Your Honour," he said quietly. "That means more than you know." Judge Caprio spent several moments composing himself, wiping his eyes and trying to regain the professional demeanor that had served him so well over the decades. But everyone in the courtroom could see that something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just about a traffic citation anymore. It was about recognition of service, of sacrifice, of the bonds that hold people together when everything else falls apart. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made even the most routine words sound ceremonial. Mr. Ellison, the citation before me charges you with exceeding the posted speed limit by 20 miles per hour. Under normal circumstances, this would result in a fine and points on your driving record. He paused, looking directly at the young man who had transformed his courtroom into something resembling a sacred space. But these are not normal circumstances, and you, sir, are not a normal defendant. Caprio leaned forward, his hands flat on the bench, his voice gaining strength and certainty. The law exists to protect people, to ensure safety, to maintain order. But the law also exists to serve justice. And justice isn't always about following rules. Sometimes it's about recognizing when rules should yield to something higher. He picked up his gavel, then set it down gently without striking it. Lance Corporal Ellison, you have served your country with honor. You have honored your friendship with Sergeant Reeves with a loyalty that humbles everyone in this courtroom. And you have stood before this court today with a dignity and honesty that reminds us all what integrity looks like. The judge's voice grew stronger, more resolute. This citation is dismissed, completely. No fine, no points, no record. You are free to return to the hospital, to be with your friend, to honor the promise you made to each other in Afghanistan. A collective exhale seemed to rise from the gallery, as if everyone had been holding their breath, waiting for this moment. But Caprio wasn't finished. Furthermore, he continued, his voice now carrying the full authority of his office, combined with his personal conviction, I want you to take a message back to Sergeant Reeves. Tell him that a judge in Providence, Rhode Island, a man he's never met, considers him a hero, not just for what he did in Afghanistan, but for the friend he helped create. Caprio's voice caught again, but he pushed through. Tell him that his sacrifice, both in Afghanistan and in the years since, has been witnessed and honored. And tell him that the promise he made you has been kept. You both made it home. And the love you've shown for each other proves that home isn't just a place, it's the people who refuse to let you face the darkness alone. The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause, not the polite, measured clapping of formal occasions, but the kind of overwhelming response that comes when people witness something that restores their faith in humanity. The college students were on their feet. The elderly veterans were wiping tears from their eyes. Even the court staff had stopped pretending to work and were openly moved by what they'd witnessed. Ellison stood throughout the applause, maintaining his military bearing, but with tears now visible in his own eyes. When the applause finally subsided, he spoke with a voice that carried both gratitude and something deeper, recognition that he had been truly seen and understood. Your Honor, I will carry your words to him. And I want you to know that what happened here today, he paused, searching for words adequate to the moment. This is why we serve, so that places like this can exist, so that justice can be tempered with mercy and law can be guided by love. He straightened to his full height, then offered a slight bow. Not military protocol, but a gesture of respect between two men who had found something profound in an unexpected place. Thank you, sir, for seeing him through me, for honoring him through your kindness to me. Judge Caprio nodded, his own emotion still visible, but now accompanied by a sense of completion, of having used his position to serve something larger than mere legal procedure. Court is in recess, he announced softly. As the formal session ended, and people began to file out, many stopped to nod respectfully at Ellison as he gathered his things. The elderly veterans lingered, clearly wanting to speak with him. The college students hung back, as if trying to absorb everything they'd witnessed. Even the court staff seemed reluctant to return to routine business after witnessing something so extraordinary. But Judge Caprio had one more gesture to make. As the courtroom emptied, he stepped down from the bench and approached Ellison directly, not as a judge to a defendant, but as one human being to another. Mr. Ellison, he said quietly, extending his hand, it has been an honor to meet you, and through you, to meet Sergeant Reeves. Ellison shook the judge's hand with both respect and warmth. The honor has been mine, Your Honor, completely. They stood there for a moment, two men from different worlds who had found common ground in the simple recognition of what matters most: loyalty, service, and the courage to honor promises, even when it costs you something. Give my regards to your friend, Caprio said softly, and remember, you both made it home. As Ellison left the courtroom, walking with that same military precision that had first caught everyone's attention, Judge Caprio remained behind for a few moments. The room was quiet now, but it carried a different kind of silence than usual. Not the emptiness of routine concluded, but the fullness of something meaningful accomplished. For once, the law had been about more than rules and penalties. It had been about recognition, about honor, about the kind of justice that understands the difference between what's legal and what's right. And in a small courtroom in Providence, Rhode Island, two men had reminded everyone present that sometimes the most important judgments have nothing to do with guilt or innocence, and everything to do with the simple act of seeing someone's humanity and choosing to honor it. 3 days later, the video of Lance Corporal Ellison's appearance in Judge Caprio's courtroom would be viewed by millions of people around the world. Comments would pour in from veterans sharing their own stories, from civilians expressing gratitude for service they'd never truly understood, from young people inspired by an example of loyalty they wanted to emulate. But in that moment, as Ellison walked out into the Providence morning to return to his friend's bedside, none of that mattered. What mattered was that he had been heard, his service had been honoured, and his promise to Sergeant Reeves could continue unimpeded by bureaucratic obstacles. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment or deterrence, or following rules to the letter. Sometimes it's simply about one human being recognising the worth of another and acting accordingly. And sometimes that's enough to restore faith in the whole system. Would you have dismissed the ticket after hearing his story? Do you think there are times when compassion should override strict adherence to rules? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one and love hearing your perspectives on these powerful moments. If this story moved you the way it moved Judge Caprio and everyone in that courtroom, show your support by hitting that like button, subscribing to our channel and ringing the notification bell so you never miss our daily uploads. Share this video with someone who believes that loyalty and honor still matter in today's world, because stories like this deserve to be remembered and celebrated. Your next incredible story is waiting for you on the screen right now. Click it, and I'll see you tomorrow at the same time with another unforgettable moment that reminds us why human connection is the most powerful force in the world.